let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Today we have with us Tristan from University College's Academic Support Network here at ASU. Tristan, I'll let you go ahead and take it away.
Sounds good. Well, thank you for having me, Abby. And here, let me share my screen real quick. Alrighty, can you see that okay? Oh, sweet. All right, well, as Abby said, I'm part of University College's Academic Support Network. I oversee our graduate writing centers. And today I'm going to be talking to you all about using AI to write in the workplace. Particularly, we'll use examples through Grammarly so you can see how that works, since that is a tool available to you all currently. But then also contextualizing it in kind of that larger writing ecosystem. So I'll start by talking a little bit about approaching AI use in general, and then we'll get into some examples of like how you could use Grammarly's AI for writing, then end with some best practice notes, resources, and time for questions if you all have any. And really the goal today is to explore what it means to use generative AI responsibly for work, understand how you can use generative AI to further your own professional development, and learn how Grammarly can support you in that process. Now, when you're first starting to use AI, you definitely want to think about how AI writes versus how humans write. Broadly speaking, large language models, they predict what words are statistically likely to come after the previous word in specific contexts based off the data set it was built on. And so sometimes it's easier to think of it kind of like when you're texting and it tries to autocomplete words for you or predict what you're going to say in the rest of the sentence. Really, large language models are thinking about word to word versus when you as a human write, you're thinking about entire ideas, even as you're transcribing word by word. And so it's easier to think about like you as humans might be thinking about it as whole paragraphs ahead, whereas the large language model isn't thinking in that larger context. It's predicting what that output should be and responding to it. Excuse me. And so while both functions are useful, it's definitely important to remember, like, as you are using generative AI, you need to be thinking about, like, where does the human come in? Where are you adding your voice? Where are you adding your thoughts? And how are you thinking about how you're using this tool? On that note, though, when you are using generative AI, you should really aim for your use to be responsible, critical, and ethical. So first, responsible, being transparent about how you're using generative AI and mindful about how you're engaging the tools to support your work. Critical, meaning that you shouldn't be just accepting generative AI results wholesale, but taking time to review, evaluate, and revise generated information. I'll say particularly on the hiring side, what sets apart resumes now is not necessarily what's been or how it's been put together, but really where that personal voice shows and how that is being reflected on and being curated for potential hiring managers. Whereas when it's very clearly just kind of a route generated cover letter or resume, it can be pretty apparent, right? Then also ethical, so being cautious and thoughtful about what information is shared in generative AI tools. What are you feeding to the tool? What are you giving up? And what shouldn't you be sharing, or at least depersonalizing before you share? So as you use these tools, you want to also make sure that you're using them to support your own work. So how are you using these to grow in your communication? How are you using critical thinking to verify and think through the results and these suggestions or options that generative AI gives you? How are you thinking about how you can use these tools to emphasize your professionalism? Really, there's that human element in all of this, and you should be considering how you can use these tools to help further your skills, further your competencies, but also what you're learning by using that and how you can explain that, your technology knowledge or your critical thinking knowledge when you are approaching job interviews or more broadly, just talking about the work you do. Now, when you do approach this work too, you also want to think about what are you asking yourself through? And really these questions can help you think about how you're using the tool and effectively measuring the results, but also what you're getting out of that tool use. So like when you're thinking about your responsible use, you might be thinking about what is my project? Who is my audience? What does my audience accept for, or expect from me from this project? Why do I want AI help, or how do I want AI to help me? Answering those questions can really specify what is the use you're asking. Rather than asking for something general, you can be more specific, be more thoughtful about what you're pulling out of those tools. When you're thinking about your critical use, which AI tool should you use? Not all tools work for everything, and some do have specific focuses. Are your prompts specific enough? So are you getting the outputs you need and that you want? Are you giving yourself enough time to analyze the results? And are you taking the time to be critical and thoughtful about the results you're getting? And then finally, when you're thinking about it through that ethical lens, asking what is AI capable of doing in this context? What is AI not capable of doing? Like if you're using something meant to help generate coding to write, probably not going to give you the best answers as if you're, or in the similar way as if you're using Grammarly, which is usually meant as a writing tool to help you write code. They might get you there, they might give you some suggestions, but they aren't really meant for that, and they might not give you as right of an answer or as careful of an answer as you might be looking for. And you can also think about, like, are you asking AI to do too much? Are you sharing any private or workplace intellectual property with the AI? And are the AI results reinforcing any biases that need to be corrected? Sometimes when you're especially sharing data sets, it will pick up on keywords, and AI has been known to kind of create that narrative around those keywords, whether or not that's fully represented in the data. So all of these just ask you to be very critical and think through how is your use and how are you understanding that use, getting back to that technology and ACE competency. You also want to be mindful of your workplace, though. I mentioned on the last slide about intellectual property, but you also want to be mindful of data security as well. So make sure you're following FERPA or HIPAA, depending on where you're working, what context you're working, to guide what should or shouldn't be shared. And then also making sure you're aware of what are the privacy guidelines for the tools you use. If you are training the tool, do you really want to train the tool on other people's social security numbers, for example, or student IDs or personal identifying information? And so being aware of what are those privacy guidelines, what can be shared or what you might need to depersonalize first, helps you make sure that you're avoiding sharing personal identifying information, submitting proprietary information or knowledge, and avoiding training those tools in that way. You also want to make sure you're aware of what guidelines are in your workplace. So is there a recommended generative AI tool for you? Are there rules or guidelines about when you can use generative AI tools? So in this way, you can think of it kind of like class, where usually faculty will share in their syllabi or in their class what they feel is acceptable use of generative AI. Similar could be in the workplace, particularly at ASU. I know ASU goes through some rigorous data privacy conversations with any vendors. So like we went through that even with Grammarly, saying this is what you can or can't use data for. And so, for example, with our Grammarly tool, none of your data that you use in it, at least under our account, is then going back and training Grammarly's model. But so now that we've kind of covered some of the things to keep in mind and to be mindful about while you're approaching, we'll talk a little bit more about using AI for writing. So really, when you're thinking about using AI for writing in the workplace, you want to think of this as a collaborative tool. You have to own your knowledge. You have to own your development as a staff member, as a working learner. And so really, you want to make sure that you're collaborating. Generative AI might contribute to your ideas, help you expand your ideas, think about outlines for genres of writing you haven't necessarily stepped into yet, right? But you need to make sure your voice is coming back into it, and thinking more about how does it extend your capabilities and growing your ability to adapt that communication. So how can you leverage it to adapt into a new genre, or to rethink how you might respond to an email? But keep in mind that these are choices, not answers. So tools can be wrong. Tools might not necessarily, or tool outputs might not necessarily fit exactly what you need. And that's why you have to keep that collaborative edge where you can say, cool, I like this idea, like you would say to your friend, or maybe this isn't one and we'll put it on the fridge for later. Whatever follows for that context for you. But you also have to learn how to best use the tool feedback. So what fits your communication style, your needs, your goals? And to some degree, as you engage with tools over the long term, you can kind of shape it so it knows what to expect from you, particularly thinking about chat GPTs like this, Grammarly's like this as well. But also you want to think about how do you better embed the tool suggestions into your work. So rather than just copy pasting whatever the tool gives you and putting it in, thinking about how does the wording sound? Does it fit with the larger paragraph? Does it fit with the larger piece you're writing? Does it all sound like it's written by one person? Does it make sense in the context in which you're writing? And that leads me to the last question here is thinking about, does your draft sound like you wrote it? It can be very apparent, especially in emails where it's a short bit of text being sent off, when it changes from your voice to robot voice back to your voice in an email chain. And while you think you might assume that people won't really pick up on it, it does especially show, particularly with folks you might engage with over the long term. Now, a little bit about Grammarly before I jump into showing some of the uses we can explore with this. So Grammarly for Education is currently available to all ASU faculty, staff, and students right now until December 2025. And so basically through this account, you have access to the base tools, so tone and fluency adjustments, plagiarism detection, word choice, and grammar explanation. There's also the generative AI tool, which has suggested prompts, in-text translation. And so the QR code here leads you there. I'll also share the link towards the end of this.
I was gonna say, Tristan, I can drop it in the chat right now if you don't mind, or do you want to wait till towards the end?
Yeah, I can drop that now.
I was like, I can drop it in. Oh, okay.
If you have it, then perfect.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I will. I'll go ahead and put it in the chat now in case anybody wants to start looking at it.
Oh, and as far as that goes, is really you're welcome to use that as much as you like, because it is essentially the equivalent of a premium account with some added educational benefits. So now we'll move to talking about AI in your writing process. So really the way I would recommend you all thinking about using generative AI for writing more holistically is thinking about how it aligns with what you're trying to do in the writing process. Are you trying to ideate or brainstorm? So what could I write? How could I write it? Are you drafting? So what can this look like when it's built out? Or when you hit that wall and you just kind of think of, I always think back to SpongeBob where he's sitting there saying, what I learned at boating school is, and you can always kind of think about like, how do you fill that white space? How do you get over that kind of initial hurdle to think about what could be in the rest of that paragraph? You can also think about revising. So how can this sound more professional or more to a confident tone or a passive voice? How can you make sure it's fitting your audience and the needs of your audience? And then finally, editing. So how can you fine tune your word choice, phrasing, or grammar? And so for this, I figured it would be easier for us to kind of jump into it live in a doc, and then we can kind of feel out how does this look in Grammarly more particularly, but also thinking about the different ways you might be writing. So first, when we come to brainstorming or ideation, we might start with a topic. We might think about, oh, hey, my supervisor said, hey, Tristan, I need you to propose a student event we can do ahead of finals. So, I mean, that seems pretty harmless, but maybe I'm feeling stuck where I want to imagine, like, what does this look like? What might a proposal look like, right? And so this is where in Grammarly, the nice thing is it's kind of all under this rewrite with Grammarly function, the little light bulb with a star in it. And so when you click on that, it then comes up with the prompt. I will say generally with Grammarly, it's very good for folks who aren't well experienced with prompt engineering or thinking about generative AI use in general, because it gives you some ideas for what you can even ask of this tool. So ideas for school, brainstorm topics, give me a research plan. When we're looking at writing, write a project progress report, ask for a favor, write a thank you note, generate a blog post, tell a story. And this is just kind of the initial ones they give you. As you write through the process, those change, and it also has other prompts that it can offer you as you go. But it's really nice because then rather than saying I have to figure out how I'm going to ask this tool to do this, I can start here. in order to be closer to my ask. For the purposes of this, though, I'm going to just prompt it myself. So, for example, here we might say proposing a student event ahead of finals, right? Well, I can ask it, of course, like what are student events we can hold before finals? And that should give me some okay options. So we might think of a study marathon, final survival kits, guest speaker series, midnight breakfast, pet therapy, which are all good ideas. But at least for me, in my context, not a lot of this applies to the writing center. Maybe midnight breakfast could be fun, or a study in our spaces, but I'm not really seeing what I need, right? And so this is where I might say, or try and prompt it or give it some more specifics. So maybe you are a writing center professional who will, maybe we say, what are some ideas for student events held or in preparation for finals? And so then we can get some more here where I'll say, oh, well, look, we see some, oh, it's going faster than I am. Finals paper writing workshops, a peer review session, one-on-one writing consultations, and it gives you kind of a little bit of a description. And so it gives you a sense of what are some of the things I can do. Maybe these don't always fit what you're doing, but it can give you a start to thinking about it. And then this is also where you can potentially look into outlining as well. I might say, well, I also don't even know how I would go about making a proposal. So maybe this is where I would say you are a writing center professional. What is an outline I could use for a finals peer review event? And so then from there, I can also get maybe a sample of what that could look like. So what Grammarly's suggesting here is an introduction. So you're welcome, your, oh, there we go, overview, and then it takes you through some potential paragraphs. So peer review session, so what that might look like. Fourth paragraph would be group reflection discussion, so kind of explaining what that could be. And then 5 closing remarks. And so like the more I read this, the more I also recognize that it's reading it as an event outline, which is actually at the top. So maybe not an outline for a proposal, and that's where I would have to refine it and say, looking, or what would a proposal outline be, versus it read me as saying, here's a proposed outline. And so I use this mostly to highlight where you do have to be specific, and you will have to work with the machine, so to speak, to give you more apt suggestions and make sure that it's understanding you correctly. Because while I might assume I'm pretty clear, it doesn't always align here, right? Whereas if I can say, what is a general outline for an event proposal? I might need to just kind of start from scratch, and then it'll give me an idea here where we go title page, executive summary, event description, target audience, goals and objectives. And so in this case, that was really all I was looking for. So maybe I can grab this and pull it in here. The nice thing is that with most prompts, it's going to give you the option to insert or retry. So you can spin it again and see, will it give you something more specific? You can also, you see the suggestions to translate it or shorten it with Grammarly. And so you can kind of choose what you want to do with it. So like if I hit insert, it's going to pull it into my paper for me here, or my working draft rather. And I can play with this as I want. So this is where I might kind of treat it as a step-by-step, where I'll start putting in peer review events, and then contact information, the other stuff for the title page, and then I can start on the executive summary. And this again, think of it as like a proposal versus a proposal of what a proposal could be versus the definitive line. So I might say, I don't like that it has a target audience. I feel like that should be assumed. So maybe I'll include that in the event description, and I can just nod to that. Maybe the goals and objectives need to be close to the executive summary, or maybe I don't even need an executive summary. But this gives me an idea of what I could include, and then it's up to me to decide what actually makes the most sense. What do I feel like is necessary? As we continue on, though, and as we move into drafting, this is where we might think about the email. So both on the edge of refining what I want to say, but also trying to think of what the space can be. I think sometimes, especially with my staff, sending emails can be that weird space where it's like, I know what to say or what I want to say, but maybe I don't know how to say it, or I'm not sure how to get that. And so this is where generative AI can be supportive of that function. So I can copy or highlight it here. And it also works in your email. So if you have the desk or the browser application, it would work in your Outlook. I just honestly didn't want to share all the unread emails in my Outlook right now. But as far as this goes, we have, dear sir, I didn't miss my appointment. Your records are wrong, Jill. So lovely Jill here, just trying to make sure we're correct and not calling her out incorrectly for missing the appointments, making sure she still has access to writing centers, all that. And so you might say, how can I respond? And so when you first highlight it and do that, it might give you a message here. So you say, dear Jill, thank you for your message. I apologize for any confusion regarding your appointment records. To help us resolve this issue, could you please provide me with the date and time of your appointment? Once I have that information, I'll be able to further look into it. Thank you for your patience. So that's a good start. And I'll be honest, like this is where sometimes prompts work, sometimes prompts don't. So that's why you need to pay attention to kind of what's giving you the information you want. Because actually with this, I had intentionally done that one because it didn't work for me earlier. So when I pulled it in the past, it tried to rewrite it as the student. And I was like, no, I'm not the student. I'm trying to respond to the student, please. And so this is where in the context, if you, where I went wrong now that I'm speaking through it, is I had initially just highlighted this and then said, respond to this. Whereas this time showing you all, I highlighted all of this, and then it was able to give me something closer to what I wanted to work with. So that's where some of that comes down to fine tuning. But as far as this goes, like maybe this is a nice initial response, but maybe I'm not sold on it. I mean, maybe I want to hear, maybe I want to compare this to something else. So I might say, revise with a more confident tone, or and professional tone. And this feels pretty professional to me, but you know, it doesn't help, or it doesn't hurt to hear other options. So you might say, thank you for your message. I appreciate you bringing this matter to my attention, versus I apologize for any confusion. To expedite the resolution of your appointment records, please provide the date and time of your appointment. And so I would say personally for me, to help resolve this issue, could you please provide me with the date and time of your appointment? That's something I'm more likely to revise and pull back into my own voice, versus to expedite resolution of your appointment records. That feels very artificial to me, very not like me. So that's where I might say, I like the first version better, and I'm happy to revise this and kind of add my own finesse to it. Whereas, like, for example, I usually like to do an explanation point. And I would say probably I'm sorry for any confusion, rather than I apologize, because it feels more active to me. And so like that's where you can make sure your voice is coming through, you're thinking through that as well. You can also start with something a little bit more informal if it's easier for you. Yo, we can correct it. And then you might say, revise this email text to be more professional and better clarify that we can correct her missed records. And then it gives you, this is maybe a little more than what I would say, but it gives you kind of a more built out text that you can kind of think through and say, okay, well, does this work better? But you know, it's in a better place already from, we can correct it, but I can figure out kind of what I want from this draft. So I hope this message finds you well. I like that. I'd probably include that. Wanted to follow up regarding this appointment. Since I'm directly responding, maybe I don't need that. And then I can see that it says, please rest assured we're taking necessary corrections. And then I can say maybe instead, hope this message finds you well. Happy to correct that. Sorry for any confusion. Thank you, Tristan. And so I can identify what are the things I want to say, what is too much for me, and kind of find that middle ground. I always show the second example because I have a few friends I know who they use text to speech, and then they're just like, what even did I talk into this phone? And so I can kind of help them get their ideas onto paper and give them a thought more immediately of like, okay, well, where else can I take this? How else might I think through what I'm trying to say here? And the same thing goes for when you're hitting a blank page where you're like, what did I learn in boating school is? You can pull up Rewrite with Grammarly and say, what are some potential ways to highlight the navigation or the lessons on navigation that I learned in boating school? Because really one of the things I like about thinking about it for drafting is it really helps you get past the blank page. So rather than thinking what I learned at boating school is, I can ask something a little bit more pointed and then think about, okay, well, I can create a visual diagram, or I've learned that, or I can share some personal experiences and anecdote about a specific navigation challenge I faced during boating school experience. I can develop a navigation cheat sheet, so summarize some of the key concepts. Maybe it's like, here's an overview of some of the key things I thought were helpful and I think we can highlight for other students. And so like even here, doesn't always hit the mark with all of the suggestions it gives, but it gives you some ways to think through, what do I want, what don't I want? Especially when it comes to writer's block, or not knowing kind of what else you want to say. Sometimes it's just easier to have some choices to be like, yeah, no, that's a terrible idea. And then from that, you're able to say, okay, cool. Well, if I don't want that, then what do I want? And so you can navigate between those choices. So then moving on to think about revision now. The nice thing about Grammarly is it helps both on the revision and editing side. For editing, I'm going to show the kind of typical Grammarly tool, typical functionality, even though it does help with some phrasing revisions, things like that. But particularly when you're thinking about larger pieces of text or you're unsure, kind of what are some other ways you can take this or where you want to go based off what you have. It's helpful to start kind of with a larger piece of text and then kind of revise down or get ideas for revision. So this is part of an abstract we did for a conference, I think it was last year, that my team and I presented at. And so really it's just talking about writing centers and generative AI and how kind of as an out-of-class support, we're in a good place to support students and faculty and kind of think from that space in between. So we have a sample article that we cited, as well as some broader descriptions. And so from here, I might highlight this and say, okay, well, I'm looking to revise, and maybe I could just ask it, identify any gaps, give me ideas for improvement, pick out my main point. And so you can see that even as I'm typing, Grammarly is starting to think about what are some potential things you can ask me. And so here, now I have kind of a menu as I'm writing, which is why I like it personally, is it just helps with kind of what do I want to ask you. But depending on what you're hoping to know, these are where you can kind of have your feel of the prompts. So pick out my main point. Do I want to make sure that my main point is coming across, particularly to someone other than myself? Because I think sometimes when we do write, we get so intertwined with what we're writing. We're like, yeah, of course you're going to draw this conclusion. I wrote it. I know. And this is the same reason why they suggest, like, when you are writing larger papers or just writing in general, it's helpful to take a day or two and kind of step away from it and come back, because you're able to come back with fresher eyes and be like, wow, did I really write this? And sometimes it's you being too hard on yourself, and sometimes you catch those things where you're like, yeah, no, I didn't make this clear enough. And so picking out your main point can be a good way to say, well, is this tool also reading the same thing I'm hoping would be read? You can also ask it to identify any gaps. So what did I miss here? What are different directions I could take this in? And maybe that's where you want to revise to. It's like, what are other directions I can take this perspective, or ideas for improvement more broadly? I'm going to just click it so you can see kind of what happens when we click it. But so with the highlighted, then it gave me some ideas here. So clarify the central message. Text could benefit from a more explicit thesis or central message at the beginning, which makes sense since this is literally the first 2 paragraphs of that abstract. And so we didn't get to the central point until I think it was like the 4th or 5th paragraph. Use examples or case studies. So we have one piece of or citation that we used here, but Grammarly is saying, well, maybe that's not enough. Maybe you should think about, are there case studies? Are there different pieces of evidence you can call upon to say, hey, this is how this is happening? But also strengthen the conclusion, which, again, not really in this draft, but definitely helps to feel or see that it's picking up. Like, conclusion could benefit or be more impactful by summarizing the key points and reinforcing overarching goals. We might also further say, how can I make this text sound more positive? I don't know what I'll get with that, but we'll try that. I usually do confident. But okay, so I did positive, and this is where sometimes you do get a little bit more than you want with generative AI tools in general. But so it says emphasize opportunities, highlight support and innovation, encourage collaboration or a collaborative spirit. So using language that promotes collaboration between faculty, staff, and writing center tutors. And then it gives you, I didn't really want it, but it gave me some rewrite incorporating these suggestions. So this is a way you can kind of envision that, which, you know, while that might not necessarily be what I was looking for in this moment, it's really cool that it gives it to you, because then you have it if you need it. So then you say, well, that's, or when you're looking at these 3, you might say, well, that's great and all, but what do I do? What would this look like? Here's a way you can start imagining that and seeing that potential changes. So definitely this is where you want to think about what are the things that you want out of the prompt or what you're hoping for, because then you can know where to focus. Especially when tools give you too little or too much information, then you can quickly identify, no, that's not quite what I wanted. Try again later, you know, or please revise and let me know what you think, tool kind of thing. Since this is the last part for the Gen AI before I get into the regular tool, I'll just also highlight that it does give you the acknowledged Grammarly Gen AI use option. And when you do that, you can have like prompts you created by Grammarly, prompts you wrote, and it does log those. These are kept within the tool, so this isn't something that, say, anyone external from you would be able to pull, but it's just contained within the data of your writing session. So if you wanted to share it, you have that option. So some people use this for an appendix where they're like, hey, here's some of the things I did. I would suggest this for your own personal use, because then you can kind of pull that and then you have what worked, what was the phrases that went well, what didn't go well, and you can kind of keep a list of how you want to frame things going forward. So that's usually kind of my own personal listing thing. And then last we'll go to editing. So the nice thing is this also comes with Grammarly's namesake tool. It's general revision tool, which is really helpful because it goes over correctness, clarity, engagement, and delivery. So thinking about how correct grammatically, how clear is your message, how engaging is your text, and then also the delivery of your text. You'll also see style guide here. Just to clarify, that does not mean like APA, MLA, something like that. This is something that can be set up by like the account holder. And so like if say ASU had a style, they could put a style guide in there, and it would grade off of that. That's not currently in function, so you won't be getting any of those style guide suggestions. But the nice thing is you can see the different colors also correspond with the highlights. So we have green here for their engagement, red for correctness, and then blue for clarity. Again, these things are suggestions more than they are like you absolutely have to change them. Sometimes with comma use, for example, Grammarly, the tool loves comma use. You might not love it as much as they do, and that's okay. And you can say, well, this, I want a comma intentionally here, but not there, and I know why I'm not choosing that. To kind of get that sense too, Grammarly does try and give you suggestions so you can hit learn more, and it will give you more of an idea of why it's giving you the suggestion. So for individually, it says this is unclear to the reader what individually is modifying. Consider moving the modifier. So giving you an example of what does a vague use here mean versus a clear use. And you can see the same thing with when it's asking me to rephrase in the meantime. Our revised version of your text may make it easier to read. So while there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, perhaps, it makes it clearer, it makes it a little easier as folks are trying to read. It's trying to tell you, maybe this isn't necessary at this point, right? And then revise sentence. So this is saying you can revise this for clarity. This is what they recommend. I think this is usually where I say yes or no. So like all 4 of these first options, we looked at these and we intentionally said, no, you know what, we're going to keep it in. Because we either liked the flow of it, it felt more in our voice. So here it's wants me to move for clarity. So instead of saying be intentional and proactive about defining, it says we must intentionally and proactively define. And so, you know, that has a more active voice, but in this context, we weren't hoping to get a more active voice. We wanted to make it impersonal, more passive, because it's something that the writing centers professionals in general must take on. So we wanted it to be a little bit more passive there, a little less active as we led into that quote. And then you can see here with the engagement, we strive. So it's saying, hey, here, choose a synonym. A written word that uses the same words over and over is less interesting for a reader than a work that uses a richer vocabulary. So it's saying, hey, you've used aim maybe a couple too many times. Consider strive instead here. And you know, it can be helpful, especially when you first do your drafts. You might be a little bit more mechanical with it, where you're like, this is what I'm trying to say, that is what I'm trying to say, and this is the next point. And as you're going through, it can be helpful to cull some of those repeated words or repeated phrasing and be intentional about like, how does that word or that text flow overall. But we'll kind of end the demo with that and move back to the PowerPoint. Because really, as we're thinking about this, there's 1,000 different ways we can use it. But I did really want to give you some ways to think about it within the context of your writing process, because I think that's where a lot of the purpose shows up, and you can kind of think about, what do I want out of this writing, or what do I need the tool to help me get the most out of this? Really though, when you're thinking about connecting it to a larger workplace, you want to think about how can Grammarly and AI help you practice effective workplace communication? How do you build skills like tone awareness, clarity, proofreading? And this is also why I wanted to show you those explanations that Grammarly gives, because it gives you some context to why might this be a suggestion I take, and you can make your own informed decision of like, no, this doesn't work for me, or I want it to be like that, right? Brainstorm and revise more efficiently rather than stare. Sometimes I think, especially with writer's block, you're like, well, let me get a coffee, do laundry for the next 2 hours, and I swear I'm going to come back to this and I'm going to write this, or at least in a school context, right? And sometimes it can be helpful to just, when you're in that flow, capture that and say, okay, cool, let's revise out some options. And if I'm not certain still after I have some examples or have some suggestions, that's a great talking point to bring to your supervisor and say, hey, I tried this. I'm not sure about how these wordings are actually working, but they're getting kind of closer at the flavor I'm hoping for. Can we work together on this? And so it doesn't always have to be just you and the tool. That can be something that becomes a larger professional development conversation, or just kind of a support in the moment. But you also want to learn prompt engineering with intention. So what are you hoping for? How do you clarify that for the tool? But overall, you need to remember that AI needs you to guide it. So it's not going to just take you where you need to go. You have to shape and mold it the right way. And then you want to make sure you're using it critically, ethically, and responsibly. Now with that, we'll turn to best practices. So as I mentioned, AI can only be as effective as your prompt. And so really with thinking through that, we wanted to share some tools to kind of start wrapping your head around what that could look like, how you might talk about that, or engage with tools. So when you aren't getting the results that you need, you should think about how you can engineer that prompt. And prompt engineering just refers to the act of designing and refining inputs in a way that would create more desired results from generative AI. I always like to share the term because it's really helpful when you're looking at articles and such, particularly because there are a number of approaches for how you might approach a prompt. So if you can look around, see what works for you. There's all kinds of acronyms and different suggested setups. So depending on where you work in, how you're trying to build your work, or what you're trying to do, whether email or proposal, things like that, that will inform what you're hoping, or inform the approach you need to take. But really with prompt engineering, it involves experimentation. So each Gen AI tool, like I said before, has its own personality. You have to account for that and know what it's going to get you. For example, Claude tends to be a little bit more flowy and wordy, whereas ChatGPT tends to be a little more short in a lot of its communications. Depending on the different one you use as well, it might use emojis instead of words. And so just accounting for what you're hoping to get out of that. And just remember, you may need multiple inputs to get the results you need. So the other thing to consider is, like, are you asking of the tool too much in one go? And if so, then how are you breaking down the prompt into steps so you can guide it to where you want? So first do this, then the next prompt might be, and then do this with that information, and then do this with that information. And you can kind of guide it where you need it. You really, as you're thinking about it though, more generally, you want to be specific about your needs. What is the background you're writing from? So you saw before I said, you are a writing center professional trying to get Grammarly to take on my identity for a moment. And then have the prompt from there, because then it tells it what is the context it's pulling from, what is it trying to respond to, or who is it trying to respond for. You can think about what is the length, the format, the tone or style that you need. Gen AI also works best with samples. So if you have a sample of your writing, or the text you're trying to respond to, or a template you leverage, that can be really helpful for giving a start and getting more specific results. But also, if ethical, provide data it can work on. So if you're looking to peel through data, or there's something that you need to respond to in a data set, that's where you'll want to think about, how do you depersonalize that? Are you sharing information or proprietary knowledge you shouldn't be? And refining from there. But then you also want to tell it what to do. So often it can be easy to focus on it, or what you should avoid. So don't do this, don't do that. But you often get better results if you tell it what you want it to focus on. So use clear language accessible to a general audience, for example, rather than don't use jargon. It then gives it kind of a better way to point and helps keep it within kind of the parameters you're working. But then, like I mentioned before, break down tasks into smaller chunks as needed. Same thing goes with like larger text. If you're looking for specific paragraph by paragraph feedback, or you want to respond to certain points, focus there, highlight those aspects versus the whole thing and hoping it will cover what the specific things you're looking for. Again, just to come back to this, as you're going through prompt engineering or thinking about your use of tools, I did want to bring you all back to these questions to ask yourself. So thinking about what is your responsible use here, who's your audience, and what are their needs? What do you need it to help with? What is your project that you're trying to do? the ethical, so thinking about what is AI capable of doing, and then are you sharing any private workplace intellectual property, and then the critical side, so thinking about, are your prompts specific enough? Are you giving yourself enough time to analyze the results produced, so you can think through it and say, hey, does this work? I think the biggest thing with critical is or it's best exemplified by thinking about it through citations. If you ask ChatGPT per se to write you a citation, it's going to give you a citation whether or not that resource exists. It's filling the citation requirement, right? So if you say APA in-text citation for this, it might give you the article you need. It might give you an article that's made up because it's just filling that ask. So you want to be intentional of thinking of how are you prompting it to give you the specific citation per the work cited, or how are you making sure that the sources that you're getting from generative AI actually exist, things like that. And then just some final notes on best practices. Really, as you're thinking about how to get what you need, you as the writer must make your own decisions. So what makes sense for your voice, your audience, your purpose. Give yourself the time to try the AI and learn how to use it. Be mindful about what information you are sharing with these tools. Ask AI for instructions and explanations to better understand. Oh, I didn't finish that sentence. But what you're hoping to do. So particularly, I think of this like when you get a description of what you need to do, or maybe you're responding to a call for papers, something like that. You can always run that through and say, what is this prompt asking me to do? How might I respond to it? And kind of start using that as a tool to break down what's the ask. So then you can come back with more specific questions for your supervisor, or have more specific questions you plan to answer in your writing. But then also record what works so you can replicate the results. Depending on how you highlight things, for example, as we saw, may give you different results. How you word things may give you different results. And so you want to be mindful of like what worked, what are some of those best practices that you learn along the way, and how do you capture them? Before we move to questions, I did want to just leave you with some quick resources. So if you're looking for more information, playing with AI tools and such, particularly for writing, we have a digital peer writing community. We have a lot of resources around the use of generative AI for writing in there. We have our interactive writing strategy guide, which goes step by step through the writing process and gives some suggestions of how you might think about using it, as well as the Grammarly pilot that I mentioned at the top. In addition to that, I did want to give some links, so I'll share the deck with you, Abby, so you can share that out as well. But the library has a Fundamentals of Gen AI for student research. Grammarly has an AI for students, as well as from Work Plus, they have strategies for ways to personalize the maze competencies. So as you're thinking about how you engage with generative AI, what you're hoping to learn from it, do with it, this is maybe a way you can use that tool to help you identify what are those goals. So that way you can articulate that to your supervisor or share with them kind of what you're building, or with others about your portfolio of work. The last two here, I did also want to highlight some 19 skills employees will need in the next 5 years. This is from Forbes. I think it came out this year, if I'm remembering correctly, but it gives kind of a sense of what are some of those main soft skills, or not soft skills, but main skills that employers might be looking for. And so as you're thinking about how do you strategize some of those goals, this might be a way to think about how generative AI fits into that, as well as the must-have competencies and skills in our new AI world. This one's an interesting read because it thinks about what are the AI competencies you might need for different venues of work going forward. I think this is from Educause, I want to say. Yeah, Educause. And so it's a little bit of a dense one, but they have a nice little, what's it called, a diagram to help you kind of break down and focus your reading from there. But with that, turn it to y'all. Do you have any questions for me or anything you wanted to dig into?
Thank you, Tristan, for spending the time with us and sharing this awesome resource with everyone. For you all, the students, I just want to echo what Tristan has just said, in the sense that as a supervisor to student employees myself, I've started to go through and on my students' work computers, I am adding this Grammarly extension and having them log in so that it is helping them as they're writing. So my students that I directly supervise, a lot of them are helping with communications. They're helping us with our newsletters. They're helping us with messages, emails. So having them or allowing them to utilize this Grammarly extension and tool in their writing is helping not only them, but also helping our team at large too. So if that's something that you all are interested in having on your work computers, please, like Tristan's saying, feel free to talk to your supervisors about it. If they have questions, they're welcome to reach out to me directly, or maybe even Tristan might be willing to have them connect with him. But we're happy to help you all. And again, just kind of echoing what Tristan was saying, I personally have been utilizing this for my own work that I'm doing here at ASU with the Work Plus initiative. And I was just sharing with Tristan last week, like sending him screenshots. They will send you like progress reports almost of how you're doing and like what your writing style is, and how, like mine, Tristan was saying, how Grammarly loves commas. Mine was definitely telling me I was missing commas throughout. So helping you just learn more about your style and where you can have improvements as well. It's just been a really beneficial tool. So any questions before we go ahead and end the recording today? And I'm just going to share again in the chat just one more time those links for the Grammarly, getting that added onto your account. Maybe my computer just started to freeze on me. But if you visit ASN's site there, scroll to the bottom, again, there's that Activate Your Grammarly for Education account. And that's how you can get started with utilizing this awesome tool that Tristan shared with us. Wonderful. Those Zoom silences are always awkward. 5 seconds feels like 5 minutes, but if nobody has any questions, thank you all so much.
And thanks for having me, Abby.
Of course.